For every loved figure in World War II history, there exists one despised by all. Between 1939 and 1945, the world witnessed both the absolute depths of human depravity and the highest peaks of moral courage. 6 million Jews systematically murdered, entire cities reduced to ash. Yet in that same darkness, ordinary people became extraordinary heroes, risking everything to save strangers. This is the story of 6 individuals who shaped the war's legacy, 3 who orchestrated unimaginable evil, and 3 who stood against the darkness. Their contrasting choices reveal a fundamental truth. In history's most terrible moments, we face a decision: to destroy or to preserve, to hate or to hope, to become monsters or to remain human. We begin with the man who made it all possible. Adolf Hitler, the architect of apocalypse. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Over the next 12 years, Hitler's dictatorship and wars unleashed a global catastrophe that claimed tens of millions of lives, commonly estimated at roughly 70 to 85 million deaths worldwide during World War II. No other political leader is more closely associated with both the war in Europe and the genocide at its core. Hitler's path to absolute power seemed almost accidental. Born in Braunau am Inn, Austria, in 1889, he spent his early years dreaming of becoming an artist. The Vienna Academy of Fine Arts rejected him twice. By 1913, he had drifted to Munich, a directionless young man with grandiose visions and festering resentments. The First World War gave him purpose. He served as a lance corporal, earning the Iron Cross. But Germany's defeat in 1918 devastated him. In the chaos of Weimar Germany, he found his calling, not in art, but in politics fueled by hatred. His message was simple and deadly. Germany had been betrayed. The Jews were responsible. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated the nation. Only through racial purity and territorial expansion could Germany reclaim its destiny. By 1933, economic depression and political instability had made millions receptive to his promises of restoration and revenge. Once in power, Hitler moved with calculated precision. The Enabling Act of March 23, 1933, gave him dictatorial authority. Trade unions were dissolved. Political opponents vanished into newly constructed concentration camps. On June 30th, 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, he ordered the execution of potential rivals within his own movement. Over 80 people were murdered in a single weekend. It was a clear message. Opposition meant death. But his true ambitions reached far beyond Germany's borders. On March 12, 1938, German troops marched into Austria. The Anschluss absorbed his homeland into the Reich without firing a shot. 6 months later, he demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid war, flew to Munich and agreed to Hitler's terms. Chamberlain returned to London waving a paper promising peace for our time. Within 6 months, Hitler had seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, making Chamberlain's promises worthless. September 1st, 1939. At 4:45 a.m., German forces invaded Poland from the west. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. Hitler's military machine operated with terrifying efficiency. Poland fell in 35 days. Denmark and Norway collapsed in April 1940. Then came the stunning blow. Between May 10th and June 22nd, 1940, German forces conquered the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped from Dunkirk. In 6 weeks, Hitler had achieved what Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany couldn't accomplish in 4 years of the First World War. Standing on the Eiffel Tower in June 1940, Hitler surveyed conquered Paris. For a moment, it seemed he had won. Western Europe lay under Nazi occupation. Only Britain remained defiant across the Channel. But Hitler had already set his sights eastward toward the Soviet Union and the Lebensraum, living space, he believed the German people required. Yet conquest was only part of his vision. The other part was extermination. On January 20th, 1942, 15 Nazi officials gathered at a lakeside villa in Wannsee, a Berlin suburb. Over breakfast, SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich presented the final solution, a systematic plan to murder 11 million European Jews. They discussed logistics like factory managers planning production quotas, railway schedules, killing capacity, body disposal methods. The Holocaust had been occurring in fits and starts since 1939. Now it would become industrial, systematic, total. Hitler never signed a written order for the final solution. He didn't need to. His speeches made his intentions clear. In a January 30th, 1939 Reichstag address, he declared that if international Jewry plunged Europe into war, the result will be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise he would spend the next 6 years fulfilling. By 1942, death camps operated across occupied Poland. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. Their sole purpose was murder. Jews from across Europe were transported in cattle cars to these facilities. Upon arrival, SS doctors conducted selections. Those deemed fit for work were temporarily spared. The elderly, children, the sick, and most women went directly to gas chambers, disguised as shower rooms. Death came from Zyklon B pellets dropped through ceiling vents. Within minutes, everyone inside was dead. Bodies were cremated in massive ovens or burned in open pits. The ashes were dumped in rivers or used as fertilizer. 6 million Jews were murdered. 2/3 of European Jewry erased. Entire communities that had existed for centuries, gone. In Poland alone, over 3 million Jews perished. The Nazis also systematically murdered Roma people, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish intelligentsia, disabled individuals, homosexuals, and political dissidents. Tens of millions of civilians and POWs died due to Nazi persecution, occupation policies, and genocide. Hitler directed this genocide while simultaneously conducting the most destructive war in human history. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, sent over 3 million German troops into the Soviet Union. Hitler had dismissed Soviet military capability. He expected victory within months. Instead, the Wehrmacht found itself locked in a brutal war of annihilation. The Battle of Stalingrad, lasting from August 1942 to February 1943, became the war's turning point. Over 2 million soldiers and civilians died or were wounded in that single battle. The German 6th Army, once considered invincible, surrendered. Still, Hitler refused to accept reality. As the Allies closed in from both east and west, he diverted resources to the Holocaust. Trains needed for military supplies instead carried Jews to death camps. In late 1944, as Soviet forces approached Auschwitz, the SS intensified the killing. Even in defeat, genocide remained a priority. By April 1945, Soviet forces fought through Berlin's streets. The Reich that Hitler promised would last 1,000 years was collapsing after 12. On April 30th, 1945, in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler dictated his final political testament. He blamed everyone but himself, the Jews, the generals, the German people who had failed him. Then he married his longtime companion Eva Braun, said farewell to his staff, and retreated to his private quarters. At approximately 3:30 p.m., he shot himself in the head while simultaneously biting a cyanide capsule. Eva Braun took only poison. Their bodies were carried to the Chancellery Garden, doused with gasoline, and burned. Hitler's death came too late for his victims. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945. The final toll was staggering. Between 70 and 85 million people dead. Entire cities destroyed. Millions displaced. The Holocaust revealed humanity's capacity for industrialized murder. Hitler had wanted to reshape the world through violence. Instead, he left only ruins and mass graves. Today, historians recognize Hitler as the embodiment of absolute evil. His name has become synonymous with genocide and totalitarian horror. Yet understanding how he rose to power remains crucial. He wasn't an alien force or supernatural evil. He was a man who exploited fear, nationalism, and economic desperation. He promised simple solutions to complex problems. He identified scapegoats and offered violence as remedy. Millions followed him willingly, either actively supporting his crimes or remaining silent as neighbors vanished. The lesson is uncomfortable but essential. Hitler's evil required accomplices, enablers, and countless ordinary people who made small moral compromises that accumulated into catastrophe. But while Hitler orchestrated the Holocaust from his chancellery, one man worked tirelessly on the other side of the Atlantic to rally the forces of democracy against tyranny. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the leader who rallied democracy. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. His voice carried across the nation through millions of radio sets. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Within hours, America declared war. The final piece of the global coalition against Hitler had fallen into place. Roosevelt had been preparing for this moment for years, but his path to wartime leadership had been anything but inevitable. Born on January 30th, 1882 in Hyde Park, New York, Roosevelt came from privilege. The Roosevelt family was wealthy, connected, and politically prominent. His distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, had served as president. Franklin seemed destined for similar greatness. He attended Harvard, studied law at Columbia, and entered politics as a New York State senator in 1910. By 1913, President Woodrow Wilson had appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His career trajectory pointed toward the highest offices. Then, catastrophe struck. In August 1921, while vacationing at Campobello Island, Roosevelt developed symptoms of what doctors later diagnosed as polio. Within days, he was paralyzed from the waist down. He was 39 years old. His political career appeared finished. Many of his advisors urged him to retire from public life. Roosevelt refused. Through sheer determination and innovative treatment, he taught himself to walk short distances using leg braces and a cane, though he never regained full mobility. He kept his disability largely hidden from the public, understanding that Americans might not accept a physically disabled president. Photographers voluntarily avoided showing him in his wheelchair. He learned to project strength while concealing weakness. In 1928, he was elected governor of New York. 4 years later, in the depths of the Great Depression, he defeated incumbent President Herbert Hoover. On March 4, 1933, just weeks after Hitler became German Chancellor, Roosevelt took the presidential oath. His first inaugural address became legendary. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. America needed that confidence. 25% unemployment, banks failing, farms foreclosed, the nation was on its knees. Roosevelt's New Deal programs transformed federal government's role in American life. Social Security, federal job programs, banking reforms, agricultural assistance. Not all succeeded, but together they restored hope. More importantly, They demonstrated that democratic government could respond to crisis without abandoning democracy itself, a sharp contrast to Europe, where economic depression was driving nations toward fascism. But Roosevelt was watching events across the Atlantic with growing alarm. Hitler's rise, Mussolini's aggression in Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War, the Munich Agreement, the invasion of Poland. He recognized that American neutrality wouldn't last. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, passed by an isolationist Congress, legally prevented him from aiding Britain or France. Roosevelt worked around these restrictions however he could. After France fell in June 1940, Britain stood alone. Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent desperate messages to Roosevelt, pleading for American destroyers, weapons, and supplies. Roosevelt wanted to help but faced enormous political opposition. The 1940 presidential election was approaching and isolationist sentiment remained strong. Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee argued passionately against intervention. Roosevelt made a calculated gamble. In September 1940, he agreed to transfer 50 aging destroyers to Britain in exchange for 99-year leases on British naval bases in the Western Hemisphere. He called it the most important action in the reinforcement of our national defense that has been taken since the Louisiana Purchase. Critics called it an illegal giveaway, but Roosevelt had committed America's resources to Britain's survival without Congress declaring war. He won re-election in November 1940, breaking the two-term tradition established by George Washington. In December, he delivered one of his most important fireside chats. America, he said, must become the great arsenal of democracy. He proposed Lend-Lease, a program allowing him to lend or lease weapons to any nation whose defense was vital to American security. In March 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. American factories began producing weapons for Britain on an unprecedented scale. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease to Stalin's government. Many Americans were horrified. The Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship that had just concluded a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. Roosevelt understood the brutal calculus. Stalin's Red Army was the only force capable of tying down the bulk of German military strength. If the Soviet Union fell, Hitler would control all Europe. American aid to the USSR wasn't about approving of Stalin, it was about ensuring Germany fought on two fronts. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American Pacific Fleet. Over 2,400 Americans died. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Roosevelt had been maneuvering toward war with Germany, but Japan struck first. 4 days later, Hitler solved Roosevelt's problem by declaring war on the United States. Now America faced enemies on both oceans. Roosevelt immediately transformed the nation into what he'd promised, the arsenal of democracy. American industrial production exceeded every projection. In 1944 alone, American factories produced nearly 100,000 aircraft, 17,000 tanks, and vast quantities of ammunition, vehicles, and supplies. American shipyards launched a merchant vessel every day. This industrial mobilization, more than any military campaign, won the war. But Roosevelt was more than just an industrial organizer. He became the linchpin of the Grand Alliance between America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Managing this coalition required extraordinary diplomatic skill. Churchill was a brilliant orator, but sometimes reckless strategist. Stalin was a paranoid dictator who suspected his allies of wanting the Soviet Union to bleed while they remained safe. Roosevelt had to balance their competing demands while advancing American interests. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, Roosevelt announced the Allies would accept nothing less than Germany's unconditional surrender. No negotiated peace, No armistice that might allow Nazism to survive and regroup. Complete victory or continued war. At Tehran in November 1943, Roosevelt met Stalin for the first time. The two men discussed Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Stalin had been demanding a second front for years, arguing that the Soviet Union was bearing the war's main burden, while Britain and America fought in peripheral theaters. Roosevelt promised that Overlord would launch in May 1944. He kept his word. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. Over 150,000 soldiers landed on D-Day. By August, Paris was liberated. But the war's physical toll on Roosevelt was becoming visible. Paralyzed below the waist since 1921, managing the enormous stress of global war from a wheelchair had exhausted him. Photographs from 1944 show a gaunt, gray figure bearing little resemblance to the vigorous leader of 1933. His personal physician knew he was dying. Roosevelt knew it too. Yet he ran for an unprecedented fourth term in 1944, winning against Republican challenger Thomas Dewey. The nation wouldn't change leaders with victory finally in sight. But Roosevelt's health was deteriorating rapidly. He suffered from congestive heart failure and severe hypertension. Every day was a struggle. In February 1945, Roosevelt traveled to Yalta in the Soviet Crimea for his final summit with Churchill and Stalin. The Allied leaders planned the occupation of Germany, the formation of the United Nations, and Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Critics later claimed Roosevelt gave too much to Stalin at Yalta. The reality was more complex. Soviet armies already occupied Eastern Europe. Roosevelt had limited leverage. He secured Stalin's commitment to join the war against Japan, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of American lives in the planned invasion of Japan's home islands. Roosevelt returned to America exhausted. On April 12, 1945, while resting at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, he complained of a terrific headache. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. At 3:35 p.m., Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. He was 63 years old. He had served as president for 12 years and 39 days, guiding America through its two greatest crises, the Great Depression and the Second World War. Roosevelt never saw VE Day, which came less than a month after his death. He never witnessed the war's final victory, but his leadership made that victory possible. He transformed an isolationist, depression-weakened nation into the world's dominant economic and military power. He forged the coalition that destroyed Hitler's regime. Most importantly, he proved that democracy could defeat fascism without becoming fascist itself. Today, historians consistently rank Roosevelt among America's three greatest presidents, alongside Washington and Lincoln. He led the nation through an existential crisis while expanding democratic participation and economic security. His fireside chats brought the presidency directly into American homes. His New Deal programs provided a safety net for the vulnerable. His wartime leadership demonstrated that democracy, for all its messiness and debate, possessed strength that totalitarianism could never match. Where Hitler promised a 1,000-year Reich built on racial supremacy and achieved only ruins and shame, Roosevelt helped build institutions designed to prevent future Holocausts: the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. These weren't perfect solutions, but they represented a vision of international cooperation rather than domination. Yet while Roosevelt mobilized armies to fight Hitler from across the Atlantic, the machinery of genocide operated at full capacity in occupied Europe, and no man embodied that machinery's cold efficiency more than Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of genocide. On October 4, 1943, in Poznan, Poland, SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler addressed a gathering of senior SS officers. His words were recorded, preserving for history one of the most chilling speeches ever delivered. He spoke openly about the Holocaust, something Nazi leaders rarely did explicitly. "I'm talking about the evacuation of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish people," he said. "Most of you will know what it means when 100 bodies lie together, when 500 are there, or when there are 1,000. And to have seen this through and, with the exception of human weaknesses, to have remained decent, that has made us hard." This was Heinrich Himmler, not a screaming demagogue like Hitler, not a sadistic camp commandant who took personal pleasure in violence. Himmler was something more terrifying, a bureaucrat of death who treated genocide as an administrative challenge requiring organization, efficiency, and dedication to duty. Born on October 7, 1900 in Munich, Heinrich Himmler came from a respectable Bavarian family. His father was a schoolmaster and tutor to Bavarian royalty. Young Heinrich was a sickly child, physically weak, suffering from chronic stomach ailments that would plague him his entire life. He kept detailed diaries recording his health, his reading, and his growing obsession with German mythology and racial theory. He was too young to fight in the First World War, something that seemed to haunt him. When revolution swept Germany in 1918 and 19, Himmler briefly joined a right-wing paramilitary unit, but he saw no combat. Instead, he studied agriculture at the Technical University of Munich, graduating in 1922. He worked briefly as a chicken farmer. It was an unremarkable beginning for a man who had become the second most powerful figure in Nazi Germany. Himmler joined the Nazi Party in 1923, receiving membership number 14,303. He participated in Hitler's failed beer hall putsch that November, though only peripherally. While Hitler went to prison, Himmler drifted through various right-wing organizations. His breakthrough came in 1929 when Hitler appointed him Reichsführer SS, leader of the Schutzstaffel, the party's small personal protection squad. At that time, the SS numbered fewer than 300 men. Himmler transformed it into the Nazi regime's most powerful and feared organization. He envisioned the SS as an elite racial vanguard, tall, blonde, physically perfect exemplars of the mythical Aryan race. Prospective members had to prove their racial purity back to 1750. They underwent rigorous physical and ideological training. By 1933, the SS had grown to 52,000 members. After Hitler seized power, Himmler's empire expanded exponentially. In 1934, Hitler gave Himmler control of the Gestapo, the secret state police. Now Himmler commanded both the SS's paramilitary forces and the apparatus of state terror. The concentration camp system, initially established to hold political prisoners, became Himmler's domain. Dachau, opened in March 1933, served as the model. By 1939, 6 major camps operated within Germany's pre-war borders. But Himmler's ambitions reached far beyond imprisoning political enemies. He was obsessed with racial ideology. He believed in a mythical Aryan race that had once ruled the world and must be purified and restored. He established the Ahnenerbe, an SS think tank dedicated to researching supposed Aryan history and racial science. He sent expeditions to Tibet searching for racial origins. He studied ancient Germanic runes and pagan rituals. Most of this was pseudo-scientific nonsense, but Himmler treated it with religious devotion. When war came in September 1939, Himmler's opportunity arrived. Following the Wehrmacht into Poland came the Einsatzgruppe, SS mobile killing squads tasked with murdering Polish intellectuals, clergy, and Jews. Between September and December 1939, over 50,000 Poles were murdered in what Nazi leadership called house cleaning. This was merely preparation for what would follow. Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 provided Himmler the perfect environment for his racial vision. 4 Einsatzgruppen units, totaling about 3,000 men, followed the German army into the Soviet Union. Their orders were explicit: kill all Jewish men of military age. Within weeks, those orders expanded to include women and children. The Einsatzgruppen shot their victims at close range, burying them in mass graves or forcing them to dig their own graves before execution. At Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kiev, Einsatzgruppen C murdered 33,771 Jews over 2 days in September 1941. The victims were ordered to undress, hand over their valuables, then march to the ravine's edge. Machine gun fire cut them down in waves. Those not killed immediately were buried alive under the next wave of bodies. By the end of 1941, Einsatzgruppen had murdered approximately 500,000 people. But shooting was inefficient and psychologically damaging to the executioners. Some SS men suffered breakdowns. Others drank heavily to cope with the killing. Himmler, ever the administrator, sought more efficient methods. Gas vans provided a partial solution. Victims were locked in sealed trucks. Carbon monoxide from the engine was pumped into the cargo area. Death took 10 to 15 minutes, but this too proved inadequate for the scale of killing Himmler envisioned. The answer was the death camp. In late 1941, Himmler ordered construction of facilities designed solely for mass murder. Belzec opened in March 1942, capable of killing 15,000 people daily. Sobibor followed in April, Treblinka in July. These were not concentration camps where prisoners labored. They were killing factories. Victims arrived by train were immediately sent to gas chambers disguised as showers and were cremated. Most lived less than 2 hours from arrival to death. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the death camps, combined forced labor and extermination. Its commandant, Rudolf Höss, later testified that between May 1940 and November 1944, approximately 1.1 million people were murdered there. Over 90% were Jewish, but Auschwitz also killed Roma, Soviet POWs, and Polish prisoners. At peak efficiency, Auschwitz could murder 6,000 people daily. Himmler visited Auschwitz on July 17, 1942, personally witnessing the entire killing process, from selection to cremation. He showed no emotion. He approved the procedures. He ordered increased capacity. For Himmler, this was simply administration. He was fulfilling the Führer's will with German efficiency. By 1943, Himmler controlled an empire. The Waffen-SS had grown to nearly 900,000 troops fighting alongside the Wehrmacht. The Gestapo operated throughout occupied Europe. Concentration camps held hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and the death camps continued their grim work. The final solution had become Himmler's greatest project. Yet as the war turned against Germany, Himmler's power became his curse. In July 1944, after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler, Himmler was given command of the reserve army. He had no military training or experience. His attempts to command armies in the field proved disastrous, but he continued expanding SS power even as Germany collapsed. In spring 1945, with Soviet forces approaching Berlin, Himmler secretly contacted the Western Allies through Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte. Himmler offered to surrender German forces to the Americans and British, excluding the Soviets. He apparently believed he could negotiate, perhaps even retain some position in a post-war Germany. When Hitler learned of this betrayal, he stripped Himmler of all positions and ordered his arrest. Himmler fled. On May 21, 1945, British forces captured him at a checkpoint. He was wearing an eye patch and carrying forged documents. 2 days later, during a medical examination, he bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. He died within minutes. Heinrich Himmler was 44 years old. The full scope of his crimes became clear during the Nuremberg trials and subsequent investigations. As Reichsführer SS and Chief of German Police, Himmler bore direct responsibility for the Holocaust. Over 6 million Jews murdered, another 5 million Soviet POWs, Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and others killed under his authority. The concentration camp system, the Einsatzgruppen, the death camps, all operated under his command. He had transformed genocide into industrial process, applying modern bureaucratic methods to ancient hatred. Today, historians recognize Himmler as one of history's most prolific mass murderers. Unlike Hitler, who rarely witnessed the consequences of his orders, Himmler personally observed executions and camp operations. He knew exactly what he was doing. He called it his duty. He called it necessary. He called his executioners decent men for not wavering in their terrible work. This was the banality of evil in its purest form. Himmler wasn't insane or possessed by demons. He was a clerk, a bureaucrat, a middle manager who happened to be managing genocide. He kept detailed records, he wrote memos, he attended meetings, and he murdered millions with the same organizational dedication others might bring to running a shipping company. But while Himmler orchestrated the Holocaust from his offices, at ground level, his policies were implemented by men who made the death camps function. No one embodied the personal sadism beneath the bureaucratic murder more than Josef Mengele. Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death. The selections at Auschwitz-Birkenau followed a routine. Trains arrived at the camp's railway platform. Families stumbled out of cattle cars, exhausted from days without food or water. SS officers divided them into two lines. One line went to the camp for forced labor. The other line went immediately to the gas chambers. Most selections were conducted by junior SS officers, who barely glanced at the prisoners. But some selections were different. When the tall, handsome SS doctor stood at the platform, survivors later testified that a chill went through the crowd. Josef Mengele conducted selections with enthusiasm, even joy. He whistled opera arias while gesturing left or right with his baton. He wore immaculate uniforms and maintained perfect grooming even in the filth and horror of Auschwitz. And he always watched for twins. Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911 in Günzburg, Bavaria. His family owned a successful farm machinery business. Mengele received an excellent education, studying philosophy and medicine. He earned doctorates in both anthropology and medicine from the University of Munich. He was intelligent, cultured, and deeply immersed in Nazi racial ideology. Mengele joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1938. He worked at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt, studying genetics under Professor Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a leading advocate of racial science. Mengele's research focused on hereditary factors, particularly in twins. When war came, he served as a medical officer with the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front, earning the Iron Cross for pulling wounded soldiers from a burning tank. In 1943, he received orders to report to Auschwitz-Birkenau as camp physician. For Mengele, this wasn't punishment, it was an opportunity. Auschwitz provided unlimited human subjects for his research. No ethics committees, no consent forms, no one to say no. He could experiment on anyone he wanted, and when his subjects died from his experiments, there were always more arriving on the next transport. Mengele's obsession was twins. He believed that studying them could unlock the secrets of heredity and help German women give birth to multiple Aryan children. When transports arrived, he walked the platform searching for twins. "Zwillinge heraus," he would shout. "Twins step forward." Parents sometimes volunteered their twins, hoping it would spare them. It usually did, temporarily. Mengele housed his twins in a special barrack, fed them better than other prisoners, even gave them candy. They called him Uncle Mengele. Mengele injected chemicals into twins' eyes, trying to change their color. He infected one twin with disease, then killed both to compare autopsies. He performed surgeries without anesthesia. He forced blood transfusions between twins of different blood types. He attempted to create conjoined twins by surgically connecting them. The mortality rate was 100%. Vera Kriegel, an Auschwitz survivor, later testified about being Mengele's subject. She was selected with her twin sister. Mengele drew large amounts of blood from them repeatedly, leaving them weak and dizzy. He measured every part of their bodies with calipers. He photographed them naked from all angles. When asked why, he simply smiled and said it was for science. But Mengele's experiments extended beyond twins. He collected eyes from victims with heterochromia, different colored eyes in each socket. He maintained a collection of these eyes in jars in his laboratory. He conducted experiments on dwarfs, particularly a family of Romanian Jews, the Ovitz family. he performed experiments testing the limits of human endurance to cold water, burns, and poisoning. Between 1943 and 1944, Mengele conducted experiments on approximately 3,000 twins at Auschwitz. Fewer than 200 survived. None of his experiments produced any legitimate scientific data. They were torture disguised as research, sadism wrapped in the language of science. What made Mengele particularly terrifying wasn't just his cruelty. Many SS officers at Auschwitz were cruel. It was his demeanor. Survivors consistently described him as charming, cultured, even friendly with his victims before he killed them. He spoke softly, he smiled, he gave children candy before injecting them with phenol to stop their hearts. He played music while conducting selections. He seemed to genuinely enjoy his work. On January 17, 1945, with Soviet forces approaching, Mengele fled Auschwitz. He took his research notes with him, considering them valuable scientific data. He traveled west, eventually surrendering to American forces under a false name. The Americans, not realizing who they had captured, released him. By 1949, Mengele had escaped to Argentina. He lived in South America for the rest of his life, moving between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Nazi hunters, particularly Simon Wiesenthal, sought him for decades. The German government convicted him in absentia in 1968 and issued an international arrest warrant. The Israeli government, which had captured and executed Adolf Eichmann in 1962, made Mengele their highest priority target. But Mengele was protected by South America's German expatriate community and corrupt local officials. He lived under various aliases, working odd jobs, always fearful of capture. His health deteriorated. The charming SS doctor became a paranoid recluse. On February 7, 1979, while swimming at a beach resort in Bertioga, Brazil, Josef Mengele suffered a stroke and drowned. He was 67 years old. His identity wasn't conclusively confirmed until 1985, when forensic investigators exhumed a body buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. DNA testing in 1992 provided final confirmation. The angel of death had escaped justice, dying peacefully while his victims, those he hadn't murdered, carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Today, Mengele's name represents the corruption of medicine by ideology. The Nuremberg Code, established during the doctor's trial in 1947, created ethical guidelines for human experimentation in direct response to Nazi medical crimes, particularly those committed by Mengele and his colleagues. Medical students worldwide study his crimes as a warning about what happens when doctors abandon their oath to do no harm. The research notes Mengele fled with, which he considered so valuable. Legitimate geneticists who examined them after the war found them scientifically worthless. His methodology was so flawed, his record-keeping so sloppy, and his conclusions so prejudiced by Nazi ideology that they contributed nothing to human knowledge. He had tortured and murdered thousands for nothing. While Mengele conducted his experiments in Auschwitz's laboratories elsewhere in the camp complex, people fought to maintain their humanity in the face of daily horror. And one young girl, hiding hundreds of miles away in Amsterdam, recorded her thoughts about the world she hoped to see again. Anne Frank, voice of hope in darkness. On her 13th birthday, June 12, 1942, Anne Frank received a gift that would make her one of the most famous writers of the 20th century. It was a red and white checkered diary with a small lock. She named it Kitty and began writing entries as letters to an imaginary friend. 3 weeks later, on July 6, 1942, her family went into hiding. Anne Frank would spend the next 2 years in a secret annex, documenting both the terror of living under Nazi occupation and the universal struggles of adolescence. Anne was born on June 12, 1929, in Frankfurt, Germany. Her father, Otto Frank, was a successful businessman. Her mother, Edith, came from a wealthy family. Anne had one older sister, Margot, who was quiet and studious while Anne was talkative and energetic. The family was Jewish, liberal, and thoroughly assimilated into German society. They spoke German at home. They celebrated both Jewish and Christian holidays. They considered themselves Germans first. Then Hitler came to power. By 1933, the Frank family recognized the danger. Otto Frank moved to Amsterdam, establishing a business selling pectin for making jam. The rest of the family followed in 1934. For 6 years, they rebuilt their lives in the Netherlands. Anne learned Dutch, attended school, made friends. She was a normal girl growing up in a normal family in what seemed like a safe country. May 10th, 1940, shattered that safety. German forces invaded the Netherlands. Within 5 days, Dutch resistance collapsed. The Frank family was trapped. Over the next 2 years, the German occupation tightened its grip. Jews were required to register. They had to wear yellow stars. They were banned from parks, theaters, restaurants. Jewish children were expelled from regular schools. Jewish businesses were confiscated. On July 5, 1942, 16-year-old Margot received a call-up notice to report to a German work camp. Otto Frank knew what this meant. The family immediately enacted a plan they had been preparing. The next morning, wearing as many clothes as they could layer on to avoid carrying suspicious luggage, the Frank family walked through Amsterdam to Otto's office building at Prinsengracht 263. Behind a movable bookcase on the building's upper floors was a hidden annex, several small rooms that would become home to 8 people. The Frank family, Otto, Edith, Margot, and Anne. Herman and Augusta van Pels, and their teenage son Peter. And later, Fritz Pfeffer, a dentist. 4 of Otto's employees knew about the hiding place and risked their lives bringing food, news, and supplies. The annex was cramped and uncomfortable. Anne shared a small room with Fritz Pfeffer, a middle-aged man she barely knew. There was no privacy. They couldn't flush the toilet during business hours for fear the noise would be heard. They couldn't open windows or speak above whispers. They lived in constant fear that any sound might alert the warehouse workers below or passers-by outside. For 2 years and 34 days, these 8 people lived in approximately 450 square feet of space, and Anne Frank documented it all in her diary. What makes Anne's diary extraordinary isn't just its historical value as a Holocaust document. It's that Anne was a talented writer who captured universal human experiences. Yes, she wrote about fear of discovery and the horrors happening outside, but she also wrote about fighting with her mother, her first crush on Peter van Pels, her frustration with the cramped quarters, her dreams of becoming a journalist. On March 29, 1944, she wrote, "I want to be useful or bring enjoyment to all people, even those I've never met. I want to go on living even after my death." She was 14 years old, hiding from genocidal maniacs, and she was thinking about her legacy as a writer. She revised her diary entries, planning to publish them after the war. She heard a Dutch government minister on the radio calling for people to preserve diaries and letters documenting the German occupation. Anne took this seriously, rewriting portions of her diary with publication in mind. She was in her cramped attic hiding place, becoming a real writer. But the annex couldn't stay hidden forever. On August 4, 1944, German security police and Dutch collaborators raided the building. Someone had betrayed them. Historians still debate who. The 8 people in hiding were arrested, along with 2 of the helpers. They were first taken to a Dutch transit camp, then deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. They arrived on September 3, 1944, among the last large transport of Dutch Jews. Upon arrival came the selection. Otto Frank, as a healthy adult male, was selected for forced labor. He survived. Edith Frank died of starvation in Auschwitz on January 6, 1945, just weeks before Soviet liberation. Anne and Margot were initially selected for labor but were transferred to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany in late October 1944. Bergen-Belsen wasn't a death camp like Auschwitz. It had no gas chambers. But by late 1944, it was completely overcrowded, with no food, no sanitation, and disease spreading unchecked. In the winter of 1945, a typhus epidemic swept through Bergen-Belsen. Both Anne and Margot contracted the disease. They were in different barracks, but managed to see each other briefly. Witnesses later reported that Anne believed her parents were dead, which devastated her. Margot died first, likely in late February 1945. Anne died a few days later, probably in early March 1945. She was 15 years old. British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945. Anne Frank had been dead for approximately 6 weeks. Had she survived just one more month, she would have been freed. Otto Frank was the only member of the 8 people from the annex to survive. When he returned to Amsterdam in June 1945, he learned that his wife and daughters were dead. Mayep Gies, one of the helpers who had supplied the annex, gave him Anne's diary, which he had found scattered on the floor after the arrest and preserved. Otto Frank read his daughter's words and realized the world needed to read them too. In 1947, he published Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex, in Dutch. An English translation, The Diary of a Young Girl, appeared in 1952. It became one of the most widely read books in the world, translated into more than 70 languages. Anne Frank's diary accomplishes something few Holocaust testimonies achieve. It makes the abstract horror of 6 million deaths personal. Readers know Anne. They watch her grow up. They share her hopes. When she dies, it's not a statistic. It's the death of someone they knew, someone who wanted to be a writer, someone who believed that, in spite of everything, people are truly good at heart. Today, the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam receives over 1.2 million visitors annually. Her diary has sold over 30 million copies. Schools worldwide teach it as both literature and history. Anne Frank has become a symbol of the Holocaust itself, not because her story was unique, but because she documented it with such humanity and hope. The tragedy is that Anne Frank's story was replicated 1.5 million times. That's how many Jewish children were murdered in the Holocaust. Most left no diaries, most left nothing but a name, if that. Anne Frank speaks for all of them. But yet while the Nazis worked to exterminate every Jew in Europe, some individuals made a different choice. One man, motivated by profit and conscience in equal measure, demonstrated that even in the heart of Nazi-occupied Poland, saving lives remained possible. Oskar Schindler, the unlikely hero. In the spring of 1940, Oskar Schindler saw an opportunity. The Germans had conquered Poland. Jewish property was being confiscated. Labor was cheap. A smart businessman could make a fortune. Schindler acquired an enamelware factory in Krakow and staffed it with Jewish workers from the Krakow ghetto. They were cheaper than Polish workers and couldn't quit. It was, by all accounts, war profiteering of the most callous kind. By 1945, Oskar Schindler was bankrupt, having spent his entire fortune bribing Nazi officials to save his workers' lives. Those workers, 1,200 Jews known as the Schindler Juden, survived the Holocaust because a womanizing, hard-drinking opportunist decided that profit mattered less than human life. Prisoners were beaten, starved, and executed for trivial infractions. Schindler's factory became a sanctuary. He bribed Goethe and other SS officials to allow his workers better treatment. He fed them extra rations. He allowed families to stay together. When the SS tried to take workers for transport to death camps, Schindler insisted they were essential to military production. He convinced officials that children could polish the inside of artillery shells, work that could only be done by small hands. It was a lie. The children did no productive work, but it kept them alive. By 1944, Soviet forces were advancing from the east. The Germans began evacuating camps and factories. Schindler petitioned to move his entire operation to Brünnlitz in his native Czechoslovakia. He compiled a list of workers essential to production, the famous Schindler's List, typed by Itzhak Stern. Over 1,200 names, men, women, children. Many had no useful skills. Some were elderly, but all were declared essential. The bribes to make this happen nearly bankrupted him. He bought the cooperation of multiple SS officials. He arranged for the transfer of heavy machinery, some of which was deliberately sabotaged, so it would never produce ammunition for Germany. The Brunlitz factory operated from October 1944 until liberation in May 1945 and produced almost no functional military goods. It was a front, an elaborate deception designed to keep over 1,000 Jews alive until the war ended. The costs were enormous. Schindler spent his entire fortune on bribes, extra food, and medical supplies. He sold his wife's jewelry. He bought black market food at inflated prices. He risked execution dozens of times. If the SS had discovered that his factory was producing nothing of military value, he would have been shot. Why did he do it? Schindler himself struggled to explain. "I knew the people who worked for me," he said years later. "When you know people, you have to behave toward them like human beings." It wasn't ideology. He never denounced Nazism politically. It was something more fundamental, a recognition of common humanity that trumped everything else. On May 9, 1945, the day after Germany's surrender, Schindler fled Brunlitz with his wife, fearing Soviet retribution as a Nazi party member and factory owner. His workers gave him a letter, signed by all of them, explaining what he had done. They gave him a ring made from gold extracted from a worker's dental bridge, inscribed with a Talmudic verse, "Whoever saves one life saves the world entire." Schindler settled in Argentina, tried farming, and failed. He moved back to Germany in 1958, tried business again, and failed again. He was a terrible businessman who drank too much and could never settle down. But the Schindler Juden supported him financially for the rest of his life. He died in Germany on October 9, 1974, and was buried in Jerusalem, the only Nazi Party member buried on Mount Zion. In 1993, he was declared righteous among the nations by Israel's Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial. Today, over 7,000 descendants of Schindler Juden live around the world. At Oskar Schindler's funeral in Jerusalem, hundreds of survivors came to honor the man who saved them. They remember a flawed, complicated man who did extraordinary good when it would have been easier to do nothing. Schindler's story reminds us that heroes aren't always noble from the start. Sometimes they're opportunists and profiteers who discover their conscience when confronted with evil. Sometimes redemption comes from the most unlikely sources, and sometimes the difference between villain and hero is simply the moment when someone decides that other people's lives matter more than their own comfort, profit, or safety. 6 people, 3 who embodied humanity's capacity for evil, 3 who demonstrated its capacity for good, all operating during the same war, often in the same places, confronting the same choices. Hitler, Himmler, and Mengele chose power, ideology, and hatred. They built their lives around destroying others. Hitler promised greatness through domination. Himmler provided the administrative machinery for genocide. Mengele provided the sadistic personal touch. Together, they were responsible for the deaths of millions. Roosevelt, Anne Frank, and Oskar Schindler chose differently. Roosevelt rallied democracy against fascism. Anne Frank maintained hope while hiding from extermination. Schindler risked everything to save people he had initially seen as exploitable labor. The contrast reveals an uncomfortable truth. The villains had institutional power. They commanded armies, controlled governments, operated death camps. The heroes had only their choices. Roosevelt had political power, yes, but faced enormous opposition. Anne Frank had only a diary and determination to preserve her humanity. Schindler had only his cunning and his conscience. Yet in the end, who truly won? Hitler's 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years and ended in a bunker. Himmler died a fugitive. Mengele spent 34 years hiding in South America, dying in obscurity. Their names are synonymous with evil. Their legacies are ruins and mass graves. Roosevelt helped build institutions designed to prevent future Holocausts. Anne Frank's diary has been read by millions and continues teaching new generations about the Holocaust's human cost. Schindler's descendants number in the thousands. Their names evoke courage, hope, and redemption. The lesson isn't that good always triumphs over evil. Too many died for such simplistic comfort. 6 million Jews murdered. Millions more killed in combat and bombardment. Entire cities destroyed. Anne Frank died at 15 in Bergen-Belsen. Roosevelt died before seeing final victory. Evil won too many battles, but evil lost the war. And 70 years later, we remember why. Not because the Allies had better weapons or greater numbers, though they did, but because the values they fought for, democracy, human dignity, the rule of law, proved more enduring than fascist dreams of racial supremacy. The choice between these paths remains relevant. Every generation faces its own versions of Hitler's scapegoating, Himmler's bureaucratic evil, and Mengele's corruption of science. And every generation produces its own Roosevelts, Anne Franks, and Schindlers, people who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The Second World War demonstrated humanity's extremes, the depths of cruelty we can sink to when we dehumanize others, the heights of courage we can reach when we recognize our common humanity. The war ended in 1945, but its lessons echo forward. We must never forget what happened. We must never forget how it happened, not through monsters appearing from nowhere, but through ordinary people making choices, small and large, that accumulated into catastrophe. And we must never forget that other ordinary people, faced with the same pressures, made different choices, harder choices, braver choices. For every Hitler orchestrating destruction, there was a Roosevelt rallying resistance. For every Himmler administering genocide, there was a Schindler subverting it. For every Mengele treating humans as experimental subjects, there was an Anne Frank insisting on seeing the good in humanity despite everything. These 6 lives remind us that in history's darkest moments, we always face a choice: to destroy or to preserve, to hate or to hope, to become the villain or to stand as a hero. The question World War II leaves us with is simple but essential: which will we choose? Until next time, keep exploring history, keep asking questions, keep seeking the truth.